Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Chantel Dresner. I'm the Vice President of Marketing at Biospace. I'll be moderating today's session on how to navigate a competitive job market. So we're just going to give everyone a few moments to join. And we're just going to get started in a few moments. Okay, so today is all about how to navigate a competitive job market. We're going to be joined today by Karina Klingman. She is Biospace's career coach columnist, also the founder of Recruitomics Consulting and the Collaboratory Career Hub, as well as Greg Klaus, Biospace Pro's recruiting manager. And they will both be sharing their expertise and advice with you based on what they have been hearing most recently in the job market. So just a few housekeeping notes today. Attendee phones are in listen-only mode today. Questions are absolutely welcome. Please submit them via the Q&A. They're anonymous to other attendees. We will do our best to answer them in the Q&A at the end of the session. There's a good chance we may not be able to get to all of them, but we will try to address as many as we can. So for those of you who are not very familiar with Biospace, we are the leading news and career site for the life sciences community. We have thousands of industry-specific jobs on our site, as well as daily news. If you want to stay on top of what's happening in our industry, I highly recommend you check out our weekly podcast shows produced by our news and insights teams, or subscribe to our free newsletters. We do offer a few different ones. Career Insider is specifically centered around career advice and job trends. It also includes our quarterly job market reports. So if you haven't already subscribed, you can visit biospace.com and click on newsletters in the nav to sign up. Last week, we also just released our annual salary report. So if you haven't had a chance to take a peek yet, we'll include a link in our follow-up email so you can dive in. Okay, so what is the state of our industry right now? If we are looking at long-term outlook, it is remaining positive. There's over 20,000 drugs in active development, and the number of active companies has continued to grow. But I probably don't need to tell you that the last year has been pretty tough. As you can see here, there were far fewer funding announcements in 2023 compared to what we were seeing in 2021, even in 2022. So it has certainly been a challenging year. Less cash, of course, means more layoffs, less hiring. If you have been feeling like it feels particularly hard to be looking for a job right now, that is probably because it is a bit tougher than usual. So the number of live jobs we have seen posted on Biospace has declined over the last couple of years. So in this graph here, you can see the average number of live jobs per month from March 2022 through to 2024. And it's pretty indicative of general hiring trends. If you look here, this is actually showing the job response rate in yellow compared to the live jobs on site. So you can see that in the last couple quarters, the response rate has really risen, meaning there are more people applying for those fewer and fewer jobs that are available. In our last survey, 78% indicated they are looking for jobs. An additional 18% are open to new opportunities. And that's including people who are both currently unemployed and employed. So basically everyone is interested in new roles right now. So it's not all doom and gloom. I don't want everyone on the call to feel discouraged. I want to emphasize that there are still plenty of companies hiring. There are new jobs being posted every day. And we are starting to hear more generally that things are beginning to thaw in terms of funding moving in the right direction. 2/3 of companies we spoke to told us that they were actively hiring. So we do have a great panel assembled here today to discuss how you can get ahead with your job search, despite everything that's happening in the market. So very big welcome to Karina and Greg. I'm going to ask them to join me now so we can kind of start our discussion. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And yeah, thanks for joining us both today. Really pleased to have you guys here. Really looking forward to all the things that we can kind of chat about. Firstly, I kind of want to just kick it off. You guys are both speaking to employers regarding recruitment, their hiring plans. What are you generally hearing in the market right now when you are speaking to different employers?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So I'll just kick it off by saying I have an active recruiting firm, and I also work on the candidate side with candidate education. So I'm sort of hearing both sides, which is interesting. And we are luckily, I mean, there are fewer R&D jobs, but we are seeing, as you pointed out, a resurgence in some jobs coming back, which is great. But on the whole, the scientific, the bench level roles are slow to come back. So we're seeing fewer of those at the moment coming back, as opposed to some of the more sort of manufacturing, quality, regulatory, et cetera.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with that completely. Most of what we have heard, and this has probably been true. I don't know, Karina, tell me if this is different for you, but for the last year or so, I would say this has been true that we haven't really been seeing the bench rolls, but we have been seeing a lot more activities. In particular, right now, we're seeing a lot more in manufacturing, engineering, some of those types of roles than we are even quality and regulatory, which have stayed pretty constant throughout the last year or so. So I think it does move around. That's pretty indicative. I've actually been a recruiter slash headhunter, if you like that term, for about 30 years. So I've kind of seen these ups and downs a lot over that time. And it happens. It's very discouraging when you're looking, but it always changes. So it's just a matter of, waiting it out. We are starting to have conversations with employers now that we weren't having even a month ago, where they're starting to talk about what they're going to do in 2024, getting hiring ramped up. I think a lot of companies, at least ones we're talking to, are talking about increasing staff over the second and third quarters. So I expect things to loosen up a little bit more than they have over the last couple of months. I don't know about the bench, but everything else is looking good.
Yeah, the bench is so highly dependent on new funding, especially in the smaller companies. So what I've seen is I work with startups exclusively. And so our hiring is very cyclical depending on funding cycles for those companies. And in the last month, we've seen clients that have been on hold with us completely, as in not hiring at all, coming back and saying, we're about to close a round, which is great news. And in that hiring plan, it does include bench scientists, which is also great news, but it also includes the slate of the folks. I think of them as like the de-risking roles. So as our companies are moving through funding rounds, those quality people, the manufacturing people, those are all de-risking activities to show that they can take things to the next step and the next step in those funding milestones. So it's kind of a combo, but I'd love to see more bench science roles come back.
Mhm.
And doesn't mean they disappeared completely, because kind of, we work a lot with smaller companies as well. We work with a lot of mid-sized companies too, and there's been a less of a decrease there. And when you get into the bigger companies, they're still hiring pretty much like they always have. I think, they have enough funding of their own that they can afford to take advantage of this market and really get some good people. So, and they're doing that. If you actually look at the job boards and some of those kinds of things, a lot of the companies that are advertising right now are the bigger companies, and they're still hiring, I think, full blast like they always have been.
Have you been finding that that's across all locations, like whether you're on the West Coast, on the East Coast, for people who are maybe looking at remote jobs? Has it been kind of the same across the board? Or are you seeing particular areas where they're hiring more or less?
I'm not seeing a lot of remote hiring right now, to be honest. I'm seeing more hybrid or in person as an expectation, unless you're looking at an alternative company where you're doing maybe more science communication or something.
Greg, what about you? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. Again, I'm not working on any remote jobs. People don't even talk to me about remote jobs anymore. Hybrid is very common, but it's hybrid not in the sense that, hey, I'll fly in every month and spend a few days on site. It's, we want you here 2 or 3 days a week, hybrid,
Right.
which means you still need to be local. So if you're talking about something where you're not in your local market, you're not going to relocate. I mean, you're going to have to relocate to that. You're not going to be able to commute that job from out of state or something like that, which was happening for, for a couple of years prior. People were just happy to get anybody they could get, and they were making accommodations for the talent. They're not really doing that now because they can find the talent locally. Since it is a different market, they don't have to relocate. They don't have to deal with flying people in. That's expensive for them, right? They gotta. So we're not really seeing remote. I think that's gone. I don't know if the candidate has caught up to that yet, but I don't think remote's going to be a normal hiring practice anymore,
Yeah.
unless it is in a unique situation like Karina said.
I would say a lot of the employers that I've spoken to most recently are almost always trying to get people back into the office if they haven't already. And typically it seems like at least 3 days a week, they're expecting people to be in the office, and more seem to be going to 4 days or wanting people as many days as they can get people into the office. I know that, however, that I feel like a lot of people are still kind of holding out for remote roles or really hoping to transition to a remote role still now. What would your advice be to people who are still looking for those working from home jobs?
Greg, you want to kick this one off?
I guess my thought about that, unless you really have a reason that you need to be remote, if it's just a preference kind of thing, then I think you have to evaluate it like you would anything else. I mean, you don't always get all the money you wanted, right? And you have to evaluate the opportunity and the long-term fit and the culture. And I think you have to look at it as a total picture instead of just kind of get remote. Because like we've just said, I just don't think the remote opportunities are going to be there. I'm going to be really interested to see how the hybrid works out long-term. I think most people are comfortable or happy with the hybrid because, I mean, forever, right? We all worked Monday through Friday or more in the office for 8 hours a day. So if we can work 3 days a week in the office and 2 days from home, I think most of the time it's an increase over what we got used to prior to the last couple of years. So I think you just have to look at that like you would anything. Now, if the opportunity is requiring you to relocate and you just won't relocate, I don't know why you're looking at that job to begin with, but I mean, those kinds of things I just don't think they're going to be there. And I think people have to get comfortable with that. Now, there are professions where that's a lot more common. Medical writers, for example, they work remote almost exclusively. So it depends a lot on what your actual role is. But I think for the most part, remote's just going to go away. And I think people just have to get comfortable with that.
I agree. I have some data, some interesting data. I actually did a remote job. We just closed a remote role, which was the first remote role I had actually done in the past maybe year at this level. It was a director of immunology role. It's a totally remote company. And interestingly, I had a similar role at a different company, similar level, director of cell biology that was on site. And I got 5 times more applicants to that remote role than to the in-person role. So know that if you do find one of those coveted remote roles advertised, you're going to have to really set yourself apart in that applicant pool.
You're competing with the whole country at that point.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it was an insane number of applicants. It was 700 applicants for a director level role. Yeah.
So I want to talk, sorry, Greg, did you have something to add?
I was just going to say, I think that competitiveness for remote jobs was always there. It's just there were more jobs. So you aren't competing with quite as many people. I mean, there were just as many people, there were just more jobs. And now there's way less remote jobs. So you're going to see a lot less of that. Just right, the percentages are different.
So I wanted to talk to you too a little bit about money and compensation. So as I mentioned, we just released our 2024 salary report. And so we survey people across the industry in different types of roles. The data that we got back indicated a modest growth, around 2%, which is far less than what we saw in previous years, like 2021, there was like an 8% jump. And we also know that 40% of organizations that we surveyed in our employment outlook report, they reported that they are struggling to meet compensation expectations. And when we asked employers, just over half thought that compensation expectations were often too high. So we also asked people, given what's going on in the market right now, we asked, are you reducing your compensation expectations due to layoffs or slower hiring? And most people are kind of sticking to their guns and aren't anticipating that they're going to be like lowering their ask or anything like that. But as you are guiding candidates through offers, as you are talking to hiring managers, what is the sense that you are getting when it comes to comp and offers, and like kind of what position are candidates taking? What position are employers taking?
I think that candidates definitely have this expectation that the money will continue to ramp like it did in the last couple of years. despite there being fewer jobs. So I'm not seeing any of our clients backtracking. I haven't had a single client backtrack on the increase in comp. To your point, that's not something we've even talked about, or decreasing benefits or anything like that. And benefits did also expand during the 2020, 2021, when it was really hard to get talent. Part of the draw sometimes was to implement some new benefits, some fun things. And those haven't gone away either. But I think that at least my clients are holding steady with their comp, at least for the next year, knowing that they maybe expanded too much during that time. And now it's sort of maybe a little bit of a realignment year. And so when I'm talking to candidates, I'm just really honest with them about that and the expectation and what the market is doing, because otherwise I feel that candidates may have a false sense that they could continue to ask for more, like they saw maybe their friends come into the industry and get, above their desired comp a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and that's exactly what so companies, I think, felt like the last couple of years pushed them too high. And I can't think of one company that didn't complain about it, to be honest. So I think they're not going to shift back down, because then they're not competitive. They're not going to be able to get the talent. So they have to stay where they're at. But they're not going to continue to push it forward, because I think they felt like it was artificially getting pushed forward, and they're still waiting for, maybe where it should be to catch back up. Candidates, on the other hand, right? We all love it when we get raises and we get more money, and we always, give us more and more and more. So I don't think candidates' expectations are necessarily out of line, because I think what they're doing is they're looking for that great opportunity, like Rena said, that they've heard other people are getting. And frankly, to most of the people I work with, to their credit, most of them do research on what their position pays and what they should expect. And so they're looking at those numbers, and they know what companies have been paying. Now, everybody wants a raise too. So if companies are internally making adjustments, which many of them were, to keep the talent that they had, everybody wants a certain percentage raise. And I don't know if they're going to be able to get that over the next year, or maybe even two, as the market, as Karina used the term, realigns itself. So, and there's always these market adjustments, right, as part of the free market economy. There's supply and demand is what dictates that. And right now there's so much supply of talent that they don't have to overpay for that talent, which is what companies felt like they were doing over the last couple of years. So that's going to stay where it is probably for the foreseeable future. I think at least this year, and probably even next year. So I think candidates, though, I don't know if they have to catch up to that. I think most of them, like I said, they're doing their research, and I think they're figuring it out. So I don't anticipate that'll be too much of a problem moving forward. Now, over the last couple of years, it was because companies weren't necessarily always offering that new range. And so, as I said, candidates are doing their research. They know what they should expect. And so there was lots of turn downs during that time, because people weren't getting enough money, which frankly isn't normal. You really don't have a high percentage of turn downs due to money. Usually it's pretty spread out across the board. And I think that's got skewed a little bit over the, in 20 and 21 particularly. But I think that that's starting to normalize back out again a little bit. And I think even the salary report, when I read through that, talked about how a large percentage of people turned down offers because of the amount of money that was offered. I think that will go away. I think that'll normalize as we move forward. And I think we'll see less of that. I think that'll figure itself out. It always does.
What about, in addition to salary, what about things like benefits? Have you been noticing anything in terms of like trends when it comes to benefits? What's becoming more typical, more typically asked for, more typically offered? Are things like relocation and bonuses and things like that still being paid out right now?
They are for critical roles. I think that's really how it's kind of always been. People always pay for location and do extra things, give you extra PTO or signing bonuses or stock options if it's a critical role. I think as you move forward, though, the quote unquote normal hiring that happens, like we've talked about, they're not going to take things away from people, I don't think, but I don't think they're going to continue to do that. I think relocation is still available, But difference is right now, companies don't need to relocate to get the talent they need. So they're not going to do that if they don't have to. So if you're asking for relocation, you've already become more expensive.
Right.
So I think that's the disadvantage there. You're not as competitive as a local candidate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, honestly, with the number of applicants that we're getting, most of my clients that I work with are more than happy to relocate for the right candidate. That's never been an issue, and it still is not. We just don't need to. So, we
Right.
can find 10 wonderful candidates that are local to interview, and we're going to hire one of those people. We don't have to cast the net as wide like we have in past years. So I think normally, especially with small companies, relocation can come in the form of a signing bonus rather than kind of the white glove, we'll move you type of relocation.
Mhm.
And we're just not seeing any of that. I don't think I've made an offer in the last 6 months that's included relocation.
Got it.
Yeah,
So
I think we did one.
you did one.
Yeah, one, not very many.
Yeah. It sounds like everyone seems to be focusing much more on their local market and sticking to more local candidates. So I do want to talk a little bit more about the actual job search itself. We know that there's a lot of competition out there right now. The first step is obviously getting through the initial screening process and securing your interview. So what is your advice for people right now on how they can really optimize their chance of securing an interview?
So I think networking is more important right now than ever before. We've always talked about how many jobs are actually come through networks, and that's not changed. But because there are maybe fewer jobs and more candidates on the market, we're giving a lot of priority to people who come into a search of mine, at least. Greg, you can comment on this, through a network, through an employee referral, or through the hiring manager's LinkedIn network or something like that. And I can tell you that I'm in the middle of a search right now where the hiring manager and I on the first week sat down and went through the resumes to sort of calibrate the search. And we both agreed to let go of a candidate that didn't seem to quite fit the bill. And a couple of days later, someone from his network reached out and said, "Hey, did you see so-and-so's application?" And so we resurfaced this person, and they're probably getting an offer this week. That was somebody we'd actually ruled out. So those sorts of stories I see over and over.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that too, because I think the networking is something people don't think about really. But great, this has just happened to us about a month ago. So we had a candidate we introduced, and she was one of half a dozen people that we introduced to this client. And they got into the interviews, and everybody had a first round, and then they were determined in the second round. So kind of the same story as Karina, but in the meantime, one of the candidates, who was just one of the candidates, right? She reached out to a contact of hers who reached out to the CEO of the company. The CEO then reached out to the hiring manager. Guess who got interviewed first in the second round? She got the job, actually. So that is something I think people they don't think about. And she just did it. It wasn't like I prompted her, or she just kind of figured out, hey, I know somebody who knows somebody. And she went ahead and made a phone call, and it ended up working to get her that first interview and got her the job, really. So I think that's a critical thing. So it's not just to get first noticed, it's to continue to work that process as you go through it. I think it's so powerful, and people just don't understand, I think, how powerful it can be. The other thing I would say is first noticed. I mean, right now, so much of the first noticed is, and to take away what Karina and I do, because we're a little bit more hands-on. I think a lot of companies rely a lot on automated systems and HR in particular, talent acquisition professionals to quote unquote screen the resumes.
Mm-hmm.
And those people aren't working the job. They're not in the factory, or they're not in the lab. So they're not necessarily as knowledgeable what the hiring manager might grab somebody and say, hey, look at that. And they might make a phone call. Whereas the talent acquisition professional might not know to look for that. So it really comes down to a lot what you're doing with your resume. And I know you and I talked about this, Chantel, recently, but you really should rewrite your resume for every single job. And you should make it reflect the key points that are critical on the job description itself. And I know that's a whole nother skill set. And I know I've read some of Karina's stuff and I've seen her talk about that. So I know that's something she has a lot of expertise in, but there's a lot of reflection you can see. If you can make your resume really look like an answer to that ad, you're probably going to get a lot more notice than you would otherwise. That's how you make yourself stand apart. The key is understanding what those keywords or those key skill sets are that they're looking for, making that jump out of your resume.
Karina, I see you nodding there. Anything to add to that?
So a big topic, I run a community for job seekers where I just answer questions. And so I have a whole free sort of webinar like this on just networking and exactly how to do that. To Greg's point, just work it in all different angles. And I have another one on resumes because it's so important to, if you don't have that warm intro, to make that resume stand out for us. And I love, Greg, that you said, make it the answer to the job description. That's exactly how I describe it. The job description is asking a question. And you and I, Greg, we're holding that question in our head as we're screening resumes. I'm looking for an XYZ scientist or, whatever that is. And if somebody takes the time to just right out of the gate in the top half of that resume, answer that question for us and say, oh, hey, I'm an XYZ scientist, and here's why, very succinctly, very clearly, it just makes our job a lot easier because we have hundreds of these to go through. And most resumes are just, we get hit with a wall of text and we're just expected to figure out what they do. And that's really not, if you just think about it, like make our lives easier and you'll probably get the interview. It's really that simple.
So in terms of like that practical application, then when they're looking at the resume, they're looking at the job description, do you recommend like using keywords and using bullets, or how should they be formatting it? How should they be highlighting those things so you can go like, look at it, that 30 seconds, and how do you get out of it what you need to get out of it?
Yeah, definitely. I think in my last career column, I sort of, maybe the one before, I touched on the format that I like to see. Old newspaper language says above the fold is important, right? So when we're looking at these, we're looking at them, my eyes are good, but not great. So I have, kind of full screen. The resume shows up as the top half. It's nice and big. That's where you want to make your impact. And so for me, how I teach people to do it is to have a headline that answers the question, that uses the language of the job description, including the job description title if possible. And then 5 really high impact bullet points that start with action verbs about what you've done with those keywords that are important to the job description right there, because then I don't have to go dig them out. I don't have to excavate them from your resume. I know in context what I'm looking at. And that plays really well with applicant tracking systems, which Greg mentioned the automation piece. When I'm doing a search through my applicant tracking system, I see the keyword I'm searching for in context. So it's embedded in the sentence that the keyword appears in. So if you can make a really high impact sentence that tells me exactly what you did with that keyword, that's really going to impact my ability to move you forward in the process.
Yeah, to add to that, and I like the way Karina said that, because what you did, don't give me a list of your job duties. Tell me what sets you apart. I want you to talk to me about accomplishments, not responsibilities. So I think most people get caught up in, it's almost like they're trying to write a job description instead of trying to write a sales document. And that's kind of, I think of your resume as your marketing brochure, not as your job description. So, and I think people lose sight of that. I think people just have no idea about that, to be honest, most of the time. So I think it comes down to making sure that you're putting on there why you're good at what you do, not just what you do, but why you're good at it. And the above the fold, I like that. That's an old time reference, but I like that one because it used to be when I first started doing this, and that was a long time ago, but everybody wrote a 1-page resume. That's not necessarily realistic anymore, but it is realistic in the sense that you have to make an impact on that first page, or they won't even read the second page or the third page or the fifth page. I mean, I get resumes from PhDs that are 25 pages long sometimes, but if they haven't caught me in the first page, I'm not looking at any of the rest of that. So, and the other thing that people do a lot, and I don't think, and people do it less now than they used to, and so I think they're getting smarter, but a lot of people still stick their education on the first page, and that takes up half the page. I don't know why you're doing that. So I think you should stick that at the end. That's where I'm looking for it anyway, and that's where most people are looking for it. And if it's critical to the job, Again, if you read the the job description, they want a PhD, put PhD after your name. Don't put your education system up there. Put that up somewhere where it highlights, and then jump into why you're good at what you do.
Mhm.
Again, it's a marketing document is how you have to think about it.
One more thing I wanted to ask about getting through screening processes to interview. What about cover letters? Do you recommend that people still write a cover letter, include a cover letter? Do they get looked at?
Sometimes, yeah, you should do it because I'll say this, about 10% of hiring managers that I work with want the cover letter, and they feel a little bit affronted if they don't have one. So it's one of those things that I personally don't look at it when I'm screening through resumes. It's not even really set up in the way my system screens resumes, but it's more context. And if you are going to do a cover letter, I suggest a T-style cover letter, which is a one-page brief cover letter that tells it's sort of in a T format, like what's the requirement and what are my qualifications, just right by side. And
Mhm.
I suggest to people that that's where you can put a little of your personality, your passion. Why did this job appeal to you? Why is this company exciting to you? Give them that in the cover letter, because the person who is reading the cover letter, if they care enough to read the cover letter, they want to know why you care.
Got it. So better safe than sorry, basically,
Yeah.
is the approach. Okay. I am also getting a lot of messages about links to resources that were mentioned. We're going to be doing an email follow-up with links to things on Biospace, resources that Karina mentioned as well. So we will include links to all of that after the webinar is over for anyone who was wondering. Okay, so let's say you've made it past the screening process, you're getting ready to prepare for an interview. Congratulations. Let's start to talk about how people should be preparing for interviews. What's kind of the first thing when you're talking to candidates who've secured an interview? Kind of how do you set them up for success?
I do with them is review the job. They have to make sure that they understand what they're applying for before they get there. So I think a lot of people go in there just thinking they're going to talk about themselves. And so they really try to go over their resume and they forget about the fact this is really about, and I tell people this all the time, every single question that you hear from the company, from the interviewer, is the same question, just phrased a different way. How can you help me? How can you solve my problem? That's really what the whole process is just about that. How can you solve my problem? And so I think they have to do a lot of research on the company. They have to understand who they're going to interview with, and they have to understand the job as best they can. Now, you're not going to know everything about it, obviously, because that's part of the reason you're interviewing is to learn what you're getting yourself into. But I think you have to go in prepared to ask questions, to understand what you're getting yourself. Almost every hiring manager I talk to when they walk, now this isn't always true for HR and talent acquisition professionals, because they are doing a lot of times, they're just doing a screening interview. They just want you to go through the background and give them the bullet points, right? Hiring managers, though, it's a lot more technical conversation and they want to know how you can help them. But a lot of those people come back with the best candidates are the ones who ask the best questions. So you have to be prepared to go in there and learn what you need to learn. So if you ask good questions, and that usually just comes down to understanding what the role is and how it fits within the structure. So I think that's what you have to be ready for, is make sure that you understand what you're going in there to interview for. And when I prep, quote unquote, candidates, that's really all we talk about is what's the job? What is it the hiring manager is looking for? And, how can you answer and how can you get the information you need to make sure you're going to be successful when you get there?
I love all of that. I think people forget that behind a job description is a human in pain. It's somebody who really needs something done for them, whether it's a role that is being created or it's a backfill, somebody's leaving and they're panicking. They're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm losing this skill set. Whatever it is, it's a human who has a real need. And some job descriptions are written better than others, but sometimes you can get a real feel for that pain if you read very closely, if you read the job description. And whether you do or you don't get a feeling for that pain point, or the pain points that you would be helping to solve or alleviate, I think a really good approach is on that first screening call with HR or your recruiter. There's always an opportunity to ask questions. And if you're not getting a sense for what that real need, that pain point is, you can ask. And the way I counsel people to ask is to say, on day one, if I could come in and take 3 things off of your plate, what would those be? And what would be the highest impact thing that I could do? And then you're going to hear from them, oh, if the recruiter has a good, and, I'm sure I try and work directly with the hiring manager and get that question answered so that I can pass that along. Some recruiting firms, especially external firms, might not be able to answer that for you. And then it's on you to do the research. But that's a really good tactic. Then when you're answering the questions, especially for the hiring team, pulling your answers always back to that pain point. So when they're asking you a question, just like Greg said, they're saying, how can you solve this problem for me? You need to answer that question, not just a list of what you've done, but a list of what you've done and what the impact was, why it mattered, and how you can actually bring that to the organization to help them.
Yeah, and a lot, keep in mind, you're not always, as much as I would like to think this isn't true, you're not always working through recruiters. I mean, lots of times those are going through human resource people, like I said earlier, who really don't know the role. And so by the time you get to the hiring manager, you have to kind of piece that together yourself through the research you've done. So to Karina's point, I think you have to be ready to talk to them about what you can do, not what you've done in the past, and sort of about how it relates to them specifically is really what it's all about. The whole process is just about that.
And in terms of interviews that are happening right now with your clients, do you find that they're still mostly conducting video, in person? I know they said that they're focusing on local. Are they typically being brought on site for interviews now? Again, now that we're kind of over past COVID, or is it still typically video?
It's a bit of a toss up, honestly. So we have kept the video interviews for most companies at the beginning stages, at least, if not for most of the process. More and more, though, my clients are wanting to bring people on site for like a final visit, but even job talks are often still remote and conducted over Zoom or whatever they're using. And that final visit is really they get to see the site, meet the people face to face, and it's more of a kind of a personality, and fitness test at the very end. But we're still keeping video interviews very much alive. And we're also seeing asynchronous video interviews becoming more and more prevalent as the very first screening step. So giving people an opportunity to answer some of the HR questions and some of the background questions via video on their own schedule, which is then shared out to the hiring team.
Okay. And how many rounds of interviews are you typically seeing? Does it vary by role, or is there kind of a typical structure?
Yeah, it really varies.
Yeah, for us, I think it varies a lot in number of steps and how those steps can work. But the overall, I guess, arcing routine is pretty similar. So in the very beginning, you typically talk to some kind of screening person, and that's usually someone in talent acquisition or somebody like that. And that can be phone or video. It's almost never on site. And those are things that just kind of, like I said, it's a screen. That then, whether they actually screen you out of the process or not, I feel like most of the time that's really just to give additional information to the hiring manager, who then first interviews are almost always video calls. Unless it's really easy to make it an on-site, it's almost always just a video situation. So, and it's usually with a hiring manager, and it becomes a very technical conversation usually. And if that goes well, then you usually come on site and, you might do a presentation, meet the team. You typically meet more than one person while you're there. And then after that, there's sometimes our follow-up interviews, or clarity interviews, or different things that can happen. Reference checks obviously happen usually at that point. What I think is interesting about reference checks, to throw in something completely off topic, but is happening now more often before the on-site interview, where it used to be like a final checkpoint thing. For us, it's happening more and more and more that's happening before they want to even bring them on site. So, but it's typically, some kind of addition, pre-screen, a technical conversation with the hiring manager, and then you're on site. Usually you meet the hiring manager again, but you meet maybe some of the other leadership. Like I said, there might be a presentation involved. With bench hiring, there's almost always a presentation involved. But with some of the others, that's not as prevalent. So, and then you get into the final stages where there's benefit conversations. And a lot of times they have a follow-up with HR just for those kinds of things, benefits and onboarding and some of those kinds of things.
What kind of questions are you typically seeing? What should people be preparing for in terms of questions for those pre-screens or those initial interviews? Something that we get asked a lot is how you should address unemployment or layoff or redundancy, either in your resume, cover letter, or in the interview. What is your advice to people and how they should address it?
Well, I think that, Greg, do you want to take this one? I feel like you were winding up for it.
Well, I was just going to say layoffs and unemployment. So in 2020 and 2021, a lot of people had big gaps in their employment, right? Because everybody was either taking advantage of the opportunity or genuinely concerned about what was happening, with the pandemic and everything that was out there. So those questions weren't even coming up as often, but as we're moving back into a more normal situation, people are asking more about that. And unless if you've got big gaps in your employment, I think especially now, it's taking people longer to find those next positions. They are getting laid off, and it's just part of the deal. And I think most companies understand that. So unless you've been gone for a couple of years or something, and you have, then you probably better have a legitimate reason for why you were gone, and most people will. I think most companies are okay with that. And I think candidates worry about that more than companies do. And I think that's probably the disconnect there. I don't think companies really, they're going to ask the question because it's sitting right there in front of them. But I think as long as you have a real answer, you'll be okay. I think the truth will set you free, right? So most of the time, it's just about telling them what's really going on.
Yeah, I agree. I think every day you are unemployed feels like an eternity. But from the company's standpoint, it's just the market. And we see great candidates that were laid off from really good companies. And I'm always looking actually for the company more so. So if I see they were at, XYZ company and I'm plugged in, I know they've done layoffs. We all know these things. But wow, great company, really relevant for the company, the client company that I'm working with. That's a no-brainer to bring them in. And then it's just that sometimes a check the box question, like it's on a pre-screen almost, that we need to know, why are you looking? What brings you to us today? But yeah, own it. It's not shameful to have been laid off. It just isn't. That is our market. It was a business decision that you could not, as the person being laid off, you could not have impacted. It was not your fault. And so I think that's really the shame and the upset and the feeling that, you're less than. That's not at all coming through from the company side. We get it.
Okay, now interview has happened. Any tips or recommendations in terms of like interview follow-up? What should candidates be doing after the interview has taken place?
Well, after every interview, you should send a thank you note. So I've been doing this long enough that it used to be that you always had to send a handwritten thank you note through the snail mail, right? Now I think it's perfectly acceptable to send an email. I would send a thank you note to every single person you talk to, not just the main person, which I think is a mistake. Don't make it a form letter you're sending out to everybody and putting different names on the top, or send a mass email to every. I would send an individual note to everybody. I still personally think a handwritten note is better, but that does take a couple, 2-3 days to get there. So maybe that's a follow-up you want to do. And if you do something like that, you probably want to reference something specific for that to make sense if you've already sent the email. I would probably mention something specific in every single thank you, though, that I sent. So if I've talked to Chantel about, our kids, then I might say something about that. If I've talked to Karina about a specific challenge we're having on the job, I would certainly reference that. So if it's something that you've connected with on that person, then I would make sure that I lean on that to go through it. The other thing I tell everybody is we already talked about this once, but this is, I think, critical, is it's follow-up. Start thinking about how your network may or may not be able to help you at this point, and make sure you're leveraging that. I gave an example of one lady earlier. I think a lot of people could do that and they could be a lot better at it, but they hesitate it for whatever reason, or frankly, they just get busy or they get sidetracked and they just don't do it. But those are two things I think that are happening. The other thing is, if you do get to the next step, You want to make sure you know what your calendar looks like. They're going to probably reach out to you to talk about that next step, and you want to be ready to move.
Just a quick question that we've had a bunch of questions come in immediately about thank you notes. If they don't have anyone's contact details, they only say maybe have one point of contact, whether that's the recruiter, HR, talent acquisition. How do they get those emails? And if you don't have their emails, is it okay to send a message on LinkedIn? So there's quite a few questions that came in just about that immediately. So
Yeah, so I'll answer that because this is a topic I just recorded a podcast on. Actually, it's a really common set of questions. So first of all, as a recruiter, I'm always happy to pass along thank you notes. So if you have had an interview and you don't, for whatever reason, have the contact information, I'm happy to pass those along. I also think, and this LinkedIn has made this a little bit challenging because lately they've changed. They're really pushing the paid options, the premium LinkedIn subscription. But you do have a number of notes that you can send along with a connection request. So if you are going to, I do think you should connect with your interviewers on LinkedIn. Just part of, it feels a little cringy, but is part of growing your network for the long term. And so a very brief thank you note there, along with a connection request, I don't think is out of order. And then you will have their email address. Now, I always think an email that is a little bit longer is important because, like Greg said, you want to personalize it. You want to talk about something you discussed in the interview, maybe provide an extra resource, something you thought of after the fact, something like that. Make it a little bit longer. So you can't do that in LinkedIn, at least on a connection request. So there's a lot of nuance there. You do need to be careful on LinkedIn because people do get a little bit spammy on there in terms of like, hey, I'm following up about this. Well, you shouldn't be following up with the interview team on the status of your interview. That does make them uncomfortable. So just keep that really separate, but growing your network is totally fine.
great. Okay, so we've had quite a few questions coming in on our Q&A. So if you guys are cool, I'm going to pivot to Q&A and throw some questions at you. There's been quite a few coming in. So like I mentioned, I don't think we're going to get to all of them, but I'm trying to kind of take out the most kind of common themes. So we sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but I've had a lot of questions coming in on preferences or like, are companies open to international talent, sponsorship, immigration, visas? What do you guys think? Are companies kind of open to that right now, or are they truly really focused on local talent?
Well, I think if the candidate's already local and we're talking about transferring visas and things like that, most companies are okay with that. That's a relatively simple thing for them to do, and it's not super expensive. And I think, for most companies, I think, keep in mind, they really do want to get the best person. So if that's what it takes, then most of them are doing it. There are some companies certainly who just won't do that. I think most of the time, those are companies who are unfamiliar with the process. Or maybe have never done that before, so it might be a little scary or whatever reason, so they're a little bit hesitant, but most companies are okay with that. Now, if you're talking about relocating from another country here, I think it goes back to what we talked about from relocation before. It's easy. So one of the biggest things is even if you're willing to pay for your own relocation, it's still going to take an extended amount of time to get started, get moved, so that's really the downfall with that. I don't think it's the visa itself necessarily that gets in your way, probably is the fact that it's going to take you longer to get there and get started. And like Karina said, this is a pain point for them. If they can actually get that resolved in a quicker amount of time, then they're always going to do that.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. That was great.
Okay. The next thing I kind of wanted to chat about is we've had a lot of questions in terms of general advice for new grads or those who are focusing on entry-level roles. It's kind of a tough time to be entering the industry, but what advice do you have for people who are maybe just transitioning into the industry or are looking for more of those entry-level roles?
It is a really tough time. So we, in the past couple of years when hiring was swifter, there was a movement away from staying in academia and doing postdocs. So we were seeing a lot of people look at the postdoc salaries, look at the industry salaries, and think, why would I do that, right? Why would I stay in a postdoc? And this is a real challenge. And there's a lot of talk around postdoc salaries in the academic world, and how it's so the NIH sort of sets a salary range, and then postdoc advisors can find funding to go above that, but usually it's not significantly above that. And that rate, that base salary is for the whole country. It's not really specific to like San Francisco, obviously, a very expensive place to live, and you would get paid the same postdoc salary there as in Michigan, or that could be the case depending on the funding in the lab. So we had a lot of people moving away from academia, and it actually created a kind of a need for postdocs. So I am seeing some people go backward. They've been in industry, they got laid off, they're having a challenge, and they didn't do the postdoc, and they think maybe I'll go back and get a postdoc. I've had now 3 different people in our community choose to do that and go back into a postdoc, which is a really interesting career path. I think very understandable right now. And it is a difficult, I can't give a lot of, I just have to say it is difficult right now. It is difficult to get into industry because there are a lot of candidates on the market who have industry experience, and that is often preferred in those roles. Greg, what are your thoughts on that?
The only thing I would add to that, I think that's all absolute. Don't get discouraged. I know that's easier said than done, but it really is a numbers game. Getting hired, and I don't care what level you're at. Now, when you're talking about entry level and postdocs moving into industry, there's more hurdles to overcome there, and there's typically more competition and less jobs, and it becomes even harder. But it really is about just keeping your head up and keep going. I think a lot of people start to take it personally when they don't get callbacks and they don't get responses, and it really isn't. It's a numbers game for the companies too. So Karina mentioned earlier, she had a remote job. She had 1 job and she got 700 applications. So that's relatively common for entry-level jobs. They'll get hundreds of applications per job. And honestly, most of the time, I think they don't even see most of those resumes. So it's really just get there as fast as you can. Try to make yourself stand out as much as possible. And we talked about how to do that. Think of your resume as accomplishment driven versus duties driven, and some of those other things you can do there. And just keep going and keep going. That would be the only thing I would add to that. Postdocs in particular, I think the pandemic worked against you a lot, because prior to that, a lot of companies were okay with postdocs moving into industry. In fact, a lot of them preferred it, especially smaller companies. That kind of went away during that time frame because there just weren't any available, and now they've kind of shifted, and it's becoming harder now for postdocs to get into industry because everybody wants industry experience now. So but that'll go the other direction again too. It always does. That always goes kind of back and forth. So just keep going, keep going. Don't get discouraged. Don't take it personally. Just keep going.
I think be a little bit data driven too about it. So if you're a scientist right now, and this floors me when I work with my hiring teams on the recruiting side, they'll be so data driven about their experiments. That within the lab, everything is absolutely regimented. There is a workflow. They know exactly what they need to do to produce the data they want. And then they get to the hiring process and it's a disaster. It's a mess. They're not tracking data and metrics until I get there and I say, why don't we apply some of the same rigorous scientific method to your hiring process as well? Think of your job search in that same way. It is a numbers game. And if you're not getting any response at all from your resume, could it be that you could experiment with your resume a little bit? Could it be that there are some things that you could look at along the way to give yourself more opportunity for success? So being a little bit scientific, to not take it personally and to think, okay, this is just an experiment. Let's iterate this and let's see how I can get the success I'm looking for.
The other thing about that too, I would add to, that's a great point, because a lot of people who won't talk to you about a job will talk to you about your resume.
Mm-hmm.
So you can actually network. That's a great opportunity to network and just get your name out there and start to know people. So even if it doesn't help you for now, when you're ready to make that change in 2 years, 5 years, or whatever that is, your network will be a lot more expanded. You'll have lots more people you can turn around and go back to again to start talking again about it. Mm-hmm. If nothing else, it'd be a great excuse to meet some. And you don't have to do that with the HR. Call the CSO at the company, mm-hmm. and they'll probably talk to you. Most people want to help other people. So if your call isn't, hey, how do I get noticed for your job? And just more about, hey, I've been having a hard time getting noticed and I'm hoping you can give me some insights, especially if it's somebody you have some kind of second connection with or something like that. The friend of a friend kind of thing, or something, a friend of your professor or somebody your professor used to work with or anything like that. I think there's some opportunity to do some networking there that you couldn't otherwise.
There's also something I would recommend just to tack on to that. As someone who does a lot of hiring for my own team, I would say that if you have any contacts who are potentially in that hiring manager position, so someone who maybe like has a team, even if it's a small team, don't be afraid to kind of ask them, like, in terms of like my resume, in terms of your advice, like, is there something here that's missing, or is there something that I could add to my resume that would make it like more appealing for a hiring manager who it's maybe put in front of, or is there something that I can do? Like, what do you recommend? What do you look for when you're looking at resumes? I find that can be really helpful. I know that I've done it for peers and colleagues before as well in the past. So don't be afraid to ask for help. It's very common. Don't feel cringy about asking, I guess. I know we only have a few minutes left, so there's just a couple more questions that I'm going to see if we can kind of address in the last few minutes. One was how to address job hopping. So if you've had a few roles who maybe less than a year or shorter terms, maybe the result of contracts. I'm going to try to lump these two questions together. I've seen a lot of questions about whether contract roles are just becoming a lot more common versus permanent roles. And if you're someone who's maybe had been forced to job hop a little bit over the last few years, how do you address that as well?
Well, I think Biospace just published an interesting article on contract roles and how they are becoming more prevalent. So I would point to that if that's something you're considering. I certainly shared that article out to my community because it's a question we get a lot. I think contracting is a really interesting, and we're seeing, again, the pandemic has changed a lot of things. We're seeing that a lot of companies are shifting their strategy around building teams to what do we need to have as a full-time permanent person to what do we want to try out? What do we want to leverage maybe a real expert in a consulting capacity to do? Or, if they're looking at a different market or they're testing the waters for something, hiring people on a contract basis might be a really smart decision for them. So there's nothing wrong with contracting. And I think, again, it goes back to just own what you've done. You need to have a cohesive timeline of what you did, why you did it, what you learned. I think that's really important, coming back to if you do have a couple of different jobs in a short period of time. Why did you make the decision if it was your decision, or why did it happen if it wasn't your decision to move jobs? What did you learn? What were you excited to do in the next job? It should be sort of a story arc. I did this, I learned this, I moved on because of this, and this is what I'm bringing, this is why I'm excited about the next role, or I was excited about that next role. So it can be a fun story that you tell.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is make sure you tell it. I think what a lot of people do is on their resume, they just list, I worked here from here to here. I worked here to here. They don't really give any reasons for leaving or indicate anything that, because, in our industry in particular, companies get bought and sold. Their product fails in trial or pre-trial. The NDA doesn't get approved, and so something changes. So lots of things can happen that are outside of the individual's control. And so I think if you can do things that indicate some of that on there, then I think it helps companies read between the lines, if you want to think about it that way. The other thing is, I think this is a lot like gaps in employment. Candidates worry about a lot more than companies do because they understand all that too, right? We know when I look at a resume and I see the person's changed jobs every year or every 2 years, the last 5 years, and then I start looking at where they worked. Most of the time I can put that together in about 15 seconds because I know what happened in those companies, right? Like Karina said, we're all pretty plugged in, so we kind of know. And lots of times, we're always going to give you a chance to answer that question. So now if your question is, I changed job every year for the last 5 years because I got bored, that's a lot different than, I got laid off twice and once somebody recruited me and offered me a better opportunity for a lot more money. So the story itself, I think, says a lot. And most companies are going to give you the opportunity to tell that story. And frankly, you're probably not that different from anybody else.
We're basically at time. So just any closing thoughts, words of encouragement you want to share to our listeners here?
just don't lose hope. It is a tough market, but it's turning around. It may take a little bit longer than any of us would like to see us back to what I would consider baseline, because I don't think we had a normal couple of years there during the pandemic. I think that was above baseline. But we had a strong, and we still do have a strong biotech industry in this country. And it is cyclical. There will be ups and downs, but don't lose hope. And I think, lean on your network through this harder time.
Persistence is the name of the game in job hunting. I think you just got to make sure you keep after it. And frankly, from the conversations I've had and things I've read, it's coming back. It's slow, but it's coming. And I think we've bottomed out, to be honest. So I think things are going to only get better from here.
Cautious optimism. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. As I mentioned, we are going to be following up with links to the resources that we mentioned, resources from Biospace, as well as Karina. So look out for that. We will be sending an email out to everyone who registered today, and don't be afraid to share any of those resources with your network if you know that they're looking to. Don't forget to subscribe to Career Insider. That's where you'll find Karina's column when it comes out. And we do provide weekly career advice that's sent out on Thursdays. Thanks so much for joining us. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, everyone. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.